The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the fourth, and for this particular sesshin, the final day of this sesshin, given circumstances that prevented from going through to its full 7-day calendar. Things change, as you've heard so many times before. And what's important for us is flexibility. Openness, awareness, flexibility. In sharing with you some of this book, In Love with the World, A Monk's Journey Through the Bardos of Living and Dying by Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche, he talks about self-identities and how challenging it is to try to step outside of a self-identity, which is basically why Zen practice can be frightening, why death is frightening. At this point, Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche is 36 years old and has decided finally, actually he had decided it quite a while ago, he's finally able to act on that decision to go and do a 3 to 4 year anonymous pilgrimage in which he steps completely out of his roles and explores the edge between life and death in a certain way. Life and death in the sense of the death of who he thinks he is, the stepping outside of his normal identity, and the more profound life that allows. This is a man who has been trained since childhood to be the continued incarnation of a main master in his lineage, in his Tibetan Buddhist lineage. And as you heard in an earlier Teisho, when he was 9 years old, his father who was his teacher at the time, asked, "Are you Mingyur Rinpoche?" My father asked me this question soon after I began studying with him when I was around 9 years old. It was so gratifying to know the correct answer that I proudly declared, "Yes, I am." Then he asked, "Can you show me the one thing in particular that makes you Mingyur Rinpoche?" I looked down the front of my body to my feet. I looked at my hands. I thought about my name. I thought about who I was in relation to my parents and my older brothers. I couldn't come up with an answer. He then made looking for the real me sound like a treasure hunt, and I earnestly searched under rocks and behind trees. When I was 11 years old, I began my studies at Sherabling, a monastery in northern India, where I brought this search inside myself through meditation. 2 years later, I entered the traditional 3-year retreat, a period of intense mind training. During this period, we novice monks did many different exercises, each one deepening our understanding of subtler levels of reality. The Tibetan word for meditation, gom, means to become familiar with how the mind works, how it creates and shapes our perceptions of ourselves and the world, how the outer layers of mind, the constructed labels, function like clothing that identifies our social identities and cloaks our naked, non-fabricated state of original mind, whether that outerwear consists of business suits, jeans, uniforms, or Buddhist robes. And that, in a nutshell, is what we are doing on our meditation cushion, and hopefully also off our meditation cushion as well. we had been sharing a book called No Self, No Problem in the last couple of session, and it has to do with the neuroanatomy of the brain and the different functions of the left and right sides of our brain. The left side, certainly in our culture being dominant, it is the side of language, the ability to discern patterns, to create stories, and it will create stories even out of nothing, as some of the early experiments with the so-called split brain subjects in psychology and neurology that were done decades ago at this point. It was an experiment to determine whether or not people who had unremitting violent episodes of epilepsy could find relief from that if the connection between the right and left hemispheres of the brain were severed. This was all in the interest of saving them extreme suffering. And as part of the process, they ended up with a cohort of subjects who they could work with to determine what the roles of the different sides of the brain were. And they did discover that the left side of the brain, the seat of stories, would come up with a story even if it didn't know the truth. And often the truth was far from it. And we should take this to heart, because we jump to conclusions all the time. And what is the percentage of those conclusions actually being accurate, given the storytelling aspect of that left brain? In our culture, in the West, excuse me, the left brain really seems to be dominant. I think, therefore I am, Descartes famously said, and that does seem to be true. When we're thinking, we feel like we exist. When we're thinking, we feel like we can control things. We feel like we're in control. We feel like we know who we are, and things are going to be much more likely to go our way than if we step out of that control. But when Jill Bolte-Taylor had that massive stroke that took out her left brain for 8 years until she was able finally to get it back online through great efforts, she discovered that she could still comprehend, although she couldn't speak language, she could still understand language, and she could still comprehend. And in fact, she could comprehend a more global reality through that right brain. So maybe we should ask, which is the real you, your left brain or your right brain? Many, many years ago, when we were all training at the Rochester Zen Center, during a session, I couldn't help but notice that Gordy Bruin was unusually focused. And indeed, he had a Kensho experience in that session. And after the session, he said to me, "Why didn't somebody tell me it's about exploring your own mind? It's about exploring your own mind." This is what we're doing, exploring our own mind. All the different nuances, all the different ways we create a reality. And now let's jump into another chapter in this book, In Love with the World. This is a chapter called Acknowledge the Wave, but Stay with the Ocean. The waves, of course, are the metaphor and the foam on the waves for all the disruptions in our life, all the different intriguing things, stories, ideas, assumptions, events and our reactions to events and so on and so forth that go on. And yet our mind is like the ocean, and there's a profound depth to it that is undisturbed by any waves. And it is this profound depth that we're seeking through our practice. Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche, in an effort to open more completely to that, has chosen to go on an anonymous, free-floating pilgrimage. He's carefully set it up so that he could be long gone before anybody knew he was gone and knew why he was gone. He had set it up so that his students were taken care of and so on and so forth, so he was not abandoning anybody. And he left. And at this point, he has gotten as far, because he left from Bodh Gaya, where his monastery, his main monastery was. He's gotten as far as Gaya, which is the next big town where the train station is. And he's waiting in the train station for the train to Varanasi. And here we're sharing this. My training had introduced me to the spacious awareness of my natural mind. We compare this awareness to open skies and oceans, references meant to invoke immeasurable vastness, even though awareness is more immeasurable than skies and oceans combined. Once we learn to recognize the ever-present quality of awareness, to let go of the conditioned and contingent mind, and recognize that we are this spacious awareness, then our thoughts and emotions manifest as waves or clouds, inseparable from awareness. With recognition, we no longer get carried away by the stories that keep our minds spinning in repetitive cycles, or jumping around like a crazy monkey. If we keep our minds entangled with these stories, then it's hard to recognize awareness. As we all know, the weather systems within awareness often become quite stormy. But the more familiar we are with awareness as an innate quality of mind, the less effective the weather has on us. Waves arise, clouds move by. When we're not stuck inside them, they lose their impact. Our sensitivity deepens, and we learn to trust the knowingness of the aware mind. I had known waves of hurricane strength in my life, but not for a very long time. And now, on a jam-packed train, I was not quite sure if my constricted breaths came from the pressure on my face or the fear in my heart. Let's jump a little bit earlier here. Day and night, the Gaya station teems with travelers, beggars, pilgrims, and crying children. Entire families sit on top of their belongings or stretch out on the platforms, either waiting for trains or because they have no place else to be. Porters balance heavy cases on their turbaned heads. Meandering cows, pigeons, and dogs make their way among floor dwellers, caged birds, and tethered goats. A public announcement system blares track and schedule information. Vendors hawking tea and snacks scream and push their way through the crowds. India is quite an experience. If anybody's ever been there, and probably some of you at least have been, it is not like anything you probably have ever encountered in your life. Men and women chew betel nuts and then spit out the red juice, which hits the ground like blobs of blood. It's noisy, tumultuous, and dirty, all features familiar to me only from afar. In the past, I would have remained in an exclusive lounge while an attendant monk purchased tickets and arranged for a porter. Now I stared through throngs cast in shadow by dim overhead bulbs. I'd never once bought a ticket for anything, and never had more weight in my backpack than a bottle of water, perhaps sunglasses and a hat. Now my backpack also contained 2 Buddhist texts that I'd chosen to take on this journey. The 10,000 rupees that I carried, which is about $150 US, had come from the many small envelopes placed on the table in my room as offerings from visitors. Lama Soto, who was his attendant, routinely collected them before retiring each evening, but for several weeks I'd hidden a little money each day. I studied the chalkboards to figure out the correct cue for the train to Varanasi. This would be my first ride in the lowest class. I was given no seat assignment. Once I had my ticket, I stood near the wall of the crowded platform, improbably hoping that the train would arrive on schedule. But I should say this was India. Thin curls of smoke from small cooking fires choked the air and heightened a cinematic vision of an underground world. As the atmosphere became increasingly claustrophobic, pressing in like a physical weight, the plan to add fuel to the fire, which was an expression that Tibetan Buddhist monks use when they're pushing the envelope to give themselves something to really have to deal with. The plan to add fuel to the fire steadily became a reality, and this was just the beginning. Exploring the true nature of my being was causing the flames to burn a bit sooner than I had anticipated. By habit, we perceive ourselves and the world around us as solid, real, and enduring. Yet, without much effort, we can easily determine that no one aspect within the whole world system exists independent of change. I'd just been in one physical location, and now I was in another. I had experienced different states of mind. We've all grown from babies to adults, but lost loved ones, watched children grow, known changes in weather, in political regimes, in styles of music and fashion, in everything. Despite appearances, no aspect of life ever stays the same. And then he continues later, I stood very erect, a little primly, as was my habit, and looked down into vagrants who had settled in for the night, some sprawled like drunks. I could have traveled first class and waited in the lounge with the ceiling fans. But this is what I asked for. Circumstances so unfamiliar as to make me unfamiliar to myself. I have been away from my monastery for an hour. Have I already reached my limit? Of course not. Shyness and vulnerability were not new to me, but they had not surged with such unexpected impact in decades. I wanted to hide, but I had nowhere to go. I could feel the tension and resistance in my body, and I acknowledged how much the surface of my mind was getting stirred up by discomfort and judgment. At the same time, a sense of stability cultivated by a lifetime of practice was also present, but it felt fragile in a way that I was not used to. Some of us meet this kind of mind state here in the Zendo. We're unsettled by all kinds of things. Could be the schedule, change in the schedule, the fact of sitting long hours, the fact of eating in unison, the fact of getting less sleep than we ordinarily would, the fact that maybe there's something else we really would much rather be doing than these few days. Of course, we're not faced with stepping outside of our comfort zone in a busy, intense train station in India. When Zui-san and I were traveling to Bodh Gaya in India for a conference, we were in the train station in Delhi. Right from the get-go, things had not worked out as we thought was planned. We arrived in Delhi. There was no one to meet us at the airport. We did have a telephone number. We did call, and they had not gotten the message that we were coming even. But they did come and pick us up and take us to a guest house. We had thought we were going to be staying in a monastery, but as it turns out, there was a group of traveling monks that were going to end up in the monastery instead, and monks and nuns cannot stay in the same place traditionally. And so we were charged with paying $24 a night to stay in a guest house of sorts. It was clean. There were beds. The bathroom was not your usual bathroom, but there was a spigot in the floor where we could take a shower, and the whole floor was concrete. And we asked about the train reservations that were supposed to have been made on a particularly nice train going to Gaia the next day. Well, it turns out no train reservations had been made, and that it was impossible to make them on that train because that train was already sold out. So we had to stay another couple of days. And on the appointed day, we went to the train station several hours early because, after all, it was India. And things are not as expected in India. And discovered that the train was delayed. And so we hung out for a while, and then we began to see that on the notice board, the train had disappeared. So we went and checked, and as it turned out, it was not going to be coming, and not going to be coming to that assigned track either, for that matter, until considerably later in the day. So we went back to the guest house, and then we came back again a couple hours early. And I would sit on what was supposed to be the platform that our train was supposed to arrive on, while Zui-san went, and I was sitting there guarding our stuff. While Zui-san went and checked information, there were beggars everywhere. At one point, one of them, a young girl, came up and actually pinched my leg, trying to get something out of me. And it was quite an experience. And I can imagine how Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche must have felt. Finally, we learned where the train was going to be taking off from, and it was just about ready to take off. So we rushed our things over to track 8 from track 2 and managed to hop on the train. It was an interesting night. It was an all-night-long train, 24-hour train, basically. Not quite. Yeah, it was 24 hours. And we were the only females in the car. The whole evening, the whole night, was a chorus of snores. It's like a symphony. And thankfully, Zui-san's father, being German and very precise, had provided us with some detailed maps of India. Without it, we would probably still be on that train. And as time went on, we began to realize that, A, the windows were all so dirty, you couldn't see out anyway. B, they didn't stop at many train stations. In fact, they often simply paused and people had to jump off, or they just rattled right through. And so we began to peruse our maps and figured out, based on the fact that we had just crossed a very wide river, where we were, and that we were nearing Gaia. And so we asked one of the other people on the train in the compartment, or it wasn't a compartment, it was a whole car, the car that we were in, if he could tell us where to get off in, when we were in Gaia, so we could get off. And as we got closer to Gaia, we realized that we better get back off the back platform of the train because we might have to jump off. The man who was helping us followed us out to the back and said, "Are you Buddhist?" And we said, yes. We were wearing our robes, by the way. And he said, just as we slowed down and hopped off, my name is Siddhartha. Arriving in Gaya, there was a throng of men who were trying to convince us to ride in their conveyance to Bodh Gaya. And apparently someone had jumped the queue and everybody else was getting quite angry at him. So we finally were able to get into a motorized motorcycle and head to Bodh Gaya. We were 3 days late for the conference, but then so was everybody else. Travel being what it is in India, it was normal. So while we were not stepping out of our identities to the degree that Mingyur Rinpoche was, I think I have a little bit of a sense of how he must have been feeling. He had never had to be on his own before. As he wrote, he had never had to buy a ticket. He'd always sat in the air-conditioned lounge, well, not necessarily air-conditioned, but the lounge with the ceiling fans going. India is quite hot, particularly in certain times of the year. And an attendant monk would go and take care of buying refreshments or buying tickets or whatever needed to be done. He was waited on. In our own lives, we are also kind of waited on. We're born into a culture. Most of us are born into the culture we live the rest of our life in. We're not, most of us, immigrants, and certainly not most of us immigrants that are struggling just simply to exist in hellish conditions as they are right now on the borders of the United States. We have it relatively easy. And we have developed, through that relative ease, a very strong sense of who we think we are. Left brain has been dominant, spinning stories about it. And all we have to do is get ourselves insulted or embarrassed, and we will come right up against the fact that we are conditioned, that we do have an identity, that in those moments is being threatened. But who is the real me? Like the young Mingyur Rinpoche asked, who is the real me? How wonderful of his father, who was a gifted teacher, who was able to encourage him to explore, to make it a game almost, to make it a treasure hunt, as he put it. It is a treasure hunt for the real treasure that lies within each one of us. And just as Mingyur Rinpoche had to face all of his attachments to his position, to his identity, and to enter experiences that he was totally unfamiliar with. We too do that on the cushion. And we must do it in order to become free of the constraints, of the narrowness, of the tightness, of the limits of this assumed identity. The Buddha, in leaving his family compound, was searching for the same thing. Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche, in leaving his monastery to go on this self-imposed anonymous pilgrimage, was doing the same thing. We don't have to step into India in all its challenges and to do it. All we have to do is step up on the Tan and really open, really explore like Gordy Bruin said, to explore my own mind. We take it for granted, and yet it offers the key to the most amazing liberation. And it's built in, and we can open to it. But the road is not so easy. This is why great determination, great perplexity, and great faith that we can open to it are essential for success. You can do it. Go for it. Thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.